It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we have ourselves a hodgepodge episode. We are going to talk about Alex Pereira and his hacked tweet. We're going to talk about PFL and the woodchipper. We're going to talk about Sean Merriman and his lamentations of why B-League promotions don't survive the UFC. And we've got a very, very serious update in the antitrust case. So if you want access to all of that, please subscribe, because some of our content is behind a paywall, and the only way to get all of it is if you're a subscriber. Now, we do have an update for next week as well. We have a guest for a show next week. It is Luke Thomas. And we had a little difficulty. We had a technical difficulty, and it was supposed to be a big, long conversation between John and Luke where I would moderate with the questions. But John over here had a power outage, and then his laptop didn't want to participate with booting up right away. So I operated most of the questions. It ended up being a great interview, but Luke has agreed to come back and have that conversation with John at a later date. So there is that. Now, John, how the heck are you? Have you survived your boot up fiasco?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's not 100% my fault. Well, first, it's the workers outside that knocked the power out in my block for, a little bit. And then the other person I want to blame is the software we use has gone through a change. And so because we haven't fully changed over, I couldn't log back on. So now hopefully we're good. And I apologize to Luke. I'm sure it was a much better conversation, just the two of you, than me bugging in. And
we were both lamenting the loss of you.
Oh, I'm sure. I like to hear that, though, even though I could not get on. But maybe next time we can get Brian Campbell, and me and him can just talk about our cats.
Yeah. See, and I could get in on the cat conversation too, because we all know I am a crazy cat lady with 3 cats.
That's too many cats.
That is never there. Those 3 words, too many cats, that's not in my vocabulary. It doesn't register with me. You can never have too many cats.
Well, I just want everybody to know I am back in LA. I left Minnesota just as the weather got perfect. So, yeah, the perfect timing by me. I left after the snow and rain, and now it's a week of 80 degrees there that I will miss out on.
It is 85 degrees here, but it's very overcast, so I am imagining that it would be about 92 degrees if it weren't for the cloud cover right now. So I'm grateful for the clouds.
Yeah, well, that's a little too warm. It's going to be like 98 over here in LA this weekend, so I'm not looking forward to that. I could be enjoying 81-degree perfection in Minnesota, but nope.
Well, next week, I'm going to be on vacation, which is why we recorded with Luke a little early to give you guys content while I'm gone. But we will be in very, very lovely weather, Michigan, to visit his father, my husband's father. So I will probably be experiencing weather that's in late 60s, early 70s weather. So I'm going to be enjoying myself while you're boiling in California.
Yeah, enjoy away.
All right, I guess we should go ahead and get started. And we are going to get to the meat and potatoes right off the bat, because there was a very serious update noted in the second antitrust case, that is Johnson v. Zuffa. And I need you to tell us about that update and what the issues are with it.
Well, last week, I think it was on the 30th, just at the end of the month, there was a new filing by the plaintiffs. And the plaintiffs' filing was they filed to address the defendant's motion to deny class certification that they filed back on April 2nd. I checked this case. I have set up to be alerted when there's new filings. I missed this completely because I was in Minnesota. My older brother showed up. Just not, a bunch of stuff happened over the weekend, but thankfully Paul Giff spotted this. and brought it to our attention. And okay, so we're going to go through a couple things about this filing, but we got to go back to the April 2nd filing. We know that Zuffa and Endeavor have been trying to fight their discovery process, and they filed a filing on April 2nd where defendant Zuffa LLC motion to deny class certification or in the alternative strike class allegations hearing requested. And what that means is basically the defendants were claiming that the named plaintiffs don't represent the class. The named plaintiffs are not, because the named plaintiffs are not bound by the arbitration agreements or class action waivers that bind the majority of fighters in the putative meet class means. So as we've discussed many times, the UFC contracts, they have a arbitration agreement and a class action waiver introduced around 2020, 2021. And what those mean is that you cannot go to court if you have a problem with UFC contracts. You have to go to an arbitrator, and you cannot take part of a mass lawsuit like a class action lawsuit. So because the previous fighters on Johnson, the named ones, which are Cajun Johnson, Tristan Connolly, and CB Dalloway, none of them signed the class action waivers. This is why they're the named plaintiffs. But they're claiming because they didn't sign the class action waivers, and apparently like 70% of the fighters now have those in their contracts in the Johnson period, that they can't represent them because under Rule 23, they don't satisfy the requirements in Rule 23A of class actions, which is that they're neither typical of the class nor adequately representative. And because of that, they're unlikely to generate common answers. In other words, because you have to have commonality in a class action, that they share something in common with all the fighters. And this large group of fighters have class action waivers and arbitration agreements, and they don't represent those fighters. So that's what the UFC Zuffa is claiming. And they're asking that basically the deny class certification. This class cannot be certified because it doesn't meet those requirements. And so what they've done now is that the defendants have filed a joint stipulation. I should say not the defendants, both parties have filed a joint stipulation to defend Zuffa's motion to deny class certification. And what they did is the plaintiffs went to the defendants and said, okay, you're claiming that we cannot, that these guys can't represent the other fighters because they're not in standing, because they don't have the same provision in their contract. And so what we agree to do is we will amend the complaint, and we're going to amend the complaint so that it does not include fighters that signed a class action waiver. So now the new definition of the class is all persons who competed in one or more live professional UFC promoted MMA bouts taking place or broadcast in the United States from July 1, 2017 until the scheme alleged herein ceases. The class excludes all persons who are not residents or citizens of the United States unless the UFC paid such persons for competing in a bout fought or broadcast in the United States. The class also excludes all persons who have signed a promotion agreement or other contract with Zuffa LLC that contains an arbitration agreement and or class action waiver. So that would greatly reduce the size of the class going through the class action. It basically eliminates all fighters that signed a class action waiver, which is huge news. Now, the question we have to ask is, why did the plaintiffs do this? Because I was at the hearing last year when they settled this, and they basically promised the judge they were going to challenge these arbitration agreements. And so the judge is going to be, he's not going to be happy if they're going forward with this case of only the fighters that did not sign the class action waiver when they basically promised him to challenge the arbitration agreement, what allowed him to agree to settle the case in the first place and split the classes. So I think you have to look at it. It's partly strategic and partly out of necessity. One is they had to separate, they had to take out the fighters that signed those waivers to guarantee that this case could move forward. I mean, you can read between the lines and see if the rule of 23A is not met, then there's no class action. There's no case to proceed with even proceed with. And so they must have been somewhat concerned that that because of those waivers, that this case could be found not to be able to go forward. And then the whole thing would fall apart. At least, at the very least, they protect the group of fighters that did not sign the class waiver and can move forward. That's one. Two, that's probably the primary reason. And then the secondary is probably a strategy that if we take them out, we can challenge it separately. Now, how are they going to challenge it? I don't know, because fighters have class action waivers. And so you have to challenge that. But do you get to go to court to challenge it, or do you have to go to an arbitrator? It's possible. Maybe they have a plan to just do mass arbitration with some of the fighters, or a bunch of the fighters. There's when in class actions, there was when they do employment breaking, pay. There's certain class actions that were taken off that are very difficult to do now because and like robbing people's pay, I should say, wage theft. That's the term I was trying to use. Wage theft cases. Sometimes they'll have like a class action waiver in the contracts, but the ruling is so clear that what a lot of firms do now is they just go to every person to arbitration, and they just, they win the case immediately and get that person added to the pool to get paid. So possibly they think that we can challenge the arbitration, and maybe if we win on the arbitration, we can just keep going one after another and just, turn into an assembly line. That's a possibility. Or they have a theory of how to challenge it as a separate case. The problem is if you make a separate complete class action with those signed to the arbitration agreements, then you might possibly lose standing on the injunctive relief portion, which is, I'm sure they don't want, because that's what the problem they have with the Lee class. So a lot of moving parts. We got to see what their next actions are going to be, because on one hand, I think this shows the serious risk of the arbitration agreements to their case that they did this. But at the same time, based on their last hearing, I know that they said they're going to challenge these arbitration agreements, or at least they indicated to the judge they plan to. So I have to assume that there's something coming up that they're going to challenge them, because otherwise they're going to show up in front of that judge. And I don't think Boulware is going to be happy at all if they've decided to completely punt on the arbitration agreements.
Yikes. Okay, that's something we'll definitely be keeping an eye on. Now we're going to switch gears here, and we're going to talk about Alex Pereira for a moment, because he had a tweet that was very specific in its language, in how unhappy he was, and he couldn't believe the way the UFC was treating him, blah, blah, blah. And then not even 45 minutes later, he comes out with a video, and he's decked out from head to toe in UFC gear, and he says that he was hacked by a single tweet. He was hacked, and they only posted one very specific thing. So I need to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, obviously it was hacked. I mean, that a hacker would, it's very common for a hacker to log in, allude to one very specific complaint, a problem issue between a fighter and his promoter, and then log back out so he can come in and declare that he was hacked. So, I mean, I'm guessing perhaps that, maybe he wasn't hacked and he had demands, and maybe his demands was to get more UFC gear. And that's why he did that appearance. That's another possibility. But it's hard it's obvious to me. And now, again, maybe he was hacked. Maybe someone did this.
I don't think so.
But it's also possible maybe someone on his team who maybe tweets on behalf of him, or whatever social media it was, that posts on his behalf said something, and and he doesn't want to throw that person under the bus. There's fighters often hand over their social media to other people, so there's a possibility that someone else did do it. Now, did they do it without his knowledge? That's another question. But my gut feeling looking at that was a message that either he or someone on his team who had a real complaint with the UFC posted. That was not some random person hacking, trying to cause problems. So that's I don't have the evidence, because he claims it was a hack, but it just seems the more likely answer. Occam's razor here. And now, what is that complaint? What is that disagreement with the UFC? There's so many possibilities there that it could be about. It's hard to imagine, but it's common for fighters to have complaints to the UFC. So, and I'm sure it's one of the common complaints that we've seen time and time again. But it does show you in some ways that fighters are very, we always, fighters are these big tough guys, but they are quick to buckle when it comes to the UFC.
Do you think Hunter sat him down and had a talk with him?
It could have been Hunter. It could. I mean, it could have also been Dana White. They called in Dana. They could have called in, Epstein. I mean, there's many possibilities. Hunter seems to be the guy that does that a lot now, but maybe Hunter was busy. But someone, or I mean, it's very possible too. No one from the UFC called him. They called other people, in his team, his management and stuff, to delay the message, or just they panicked. Someone from his team saw it and panicked on their behalf. As we've seen with the settlement, how many fighters were nervous to even collect and hadn't talked to the UFC. Just the fact that other people could spread a message or tell you, oh, that's a bad idea, they're going to come back and get you for that, is enough to convince people to retract a statement or to issue a new statement. So it's hard to say. It's possible, very possible, based on past experience, that someone from the UFC contacted him and gave him a talk to. It's also just as likely that no one talked to him and the fear set in on his own side. And he, that the fear of what the UFC could do or what it could mean for the relationship. And he changed his message before even talking to them.
Well, here's what I think. I think that Hunter went over there and said, "Sir, what are you doing here? You know this is not the route." That's what I think happened. I can't help myself. And I painted Hunter into that role because Dana seems to be very preoccupied these days. So I feel like it's Hunter. I saw a photo of him. Apparently, he went over to Dagestan to talk to Team Makachev. And I think it's about fighting Ilia Topuria. I think that they may have hit a point in negotiations that required him to go all the way to Dagestan. So I feel like maybe Hunter said something. I don't know. That's just my personal view here, though.
That's possible, but it's also possible, I think, that someone like Glover Teixeira or someone else saw the message and called, "Oh, you don't want to do that. I've been around longer. I know how these guys work," and they talked him into retracting it before anybody from the UFC even said anything.
I think that Glover would be the one to do that too. Yep, to protect his bestie from ruining his own investments. All right.
Yeah, though, I mean, it shouldn't really matter. Fighters should be allowed to mouth off what they want of their complaints.
Yep. Now, what are your thoughts on the released pay-per-view numbers of the Fatal Fury boxing event?
Well, they're released by Ring Magazine, I believe, right?
Yes.
Which is owned by Turki Al-Sheikh, and I don't think they're not a publicly traded company. There's no rules saying they have to issue a correct statement. It sounds plausible because it's pretty low. 250,000 pay-per-view buys, they said. But the problem with that number, it's not as helpful as it sounds, because you're like, well, 250,000, it's not a disaster. That's if at $60 a pay-per-view, let's say that would be $15 million gross. But the problem is it doesn't break down the pay-per-view buys. It says 250,000. It doesn't say how many are in the United States versus how many overseas. The non-American pay-per-views, Ireland, the UK, rest of the world, I believe, are around $25 on average.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a much lower. So if a chunk of that is from the rest of the world, although I believe the majority would be in the United States, because the fan bases, the interest, and the time was all built around the United States. Garcia, Lopez, and Haney appeal to American fans more than anybody else. So I imagine the majority in America, but it doesn't tell you how much were international, how much was domestic. So it's hard to, figure out what the amount of actual pay-per-view gross would be. It also doesn't tell you how many of those buys were solely for this event or how many were part of the Canelo package, because if it's part of the Canelo package, I believe it was $90 for both. So you'd get a discount. So that means you'd make less per buy on that. So putting them so it's very hard to just determine how well it really did without knowing, the breakdown for each of those parts, because it's hard to get a gross amount. But, if the 250,000 was purely domestic, then it's not so bad. If it's a lot more international and very, and if almost all of them were for the Canelo fight, with the upgrades, you get this as well. That's less money made. So it's, it goes from anywhere from being kind of mediocre sales to or even poor to decent sales, and it's hard to determine which is which because we don't know the breakdown of the actual sales.
What are your thoughts on Canelo possibly breaking Mayweather's $1 billion earning record?
Well, this is the grain of salt in this whole thing is they released some purse information he supposedly has on his contract with the Saudis, which is that it's a $400 million deal. I find that hard to believe. I mean, even with the level that Canelo is and how much the Saudis are throwing around, previously we had a rumor that it was a $200 million deal. So a $400 million is absurd, that he was getting paid $80 million to fight William School. I mean, I really find that hard to believe that they would pay that kind of money for him to fight William School and to go over to Saudi Arabia, that he's paying another $150 million to fight Crawford. That's, less unrealistic, but even that sounds grossly inflated because the numbers that were being thrown around by others, including Eddie Hearn, were 80 to 100 million for him, which seems much more realistic. But if he does get 400 million, I mean, that's just an insane amount of money that would probably put him past Mayweather's income. And on top of it, it kind of explains a lot of his behavior. We've talked about this in the past that he has moved away from being a prize fighter to building his business empire, and prize fighting is just an asset in it, and that's why he's probably ducking. And I rarely use the word ducking in combat sports, but he ducked David Benavidez. He's kind of picking and choosing his opponents because he's trying to maximize his returns now, because I don't think his legacy is his primary concern. Before, he was always interested in getting the belts and kind of proving he's the best. Now he's like, what are the most lucrative fights and the ones that can preserve my position at the top the longest? Because I can put that money into my gas stations and all my other investments and just build up my business empire I have going, and an extra 400 million goes a long ways to that. I still think that seems way too high an amount to him to be actually getting paid even though it's the Saudis. I think the 200 million number thrown around earlier is much more plausible.
But you got to remember that DAZN made a deal with him for like 365 million once.
Yeah, over 11 fights though. $35 million per fight, except for the first one was 15 million. So you're talking a much lower, you're talking 100 million a fight for Turki Al-Sheikh versus 35 million a fight for DAZN. I guess you could add, he gets the gate, he gets sponsorship, so it really would have been about 45 million on average, but still. But also he was fighting, DAZN expected him to fight better competition. The Saudis are letting him fight William School for that kind of money. I mean, that's
I'm sorry.
It
just makes me laugh.
Yeah,
William School. Who is William School, y'all?
Yeah, I'm still angry about that card over the weekend. That was terrible.
Yeah.
Terrible.
The $1 billion man who averaged landing 5 strikes per round. 5.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't even land a strike, apparently, according to CompuBox.
In the first round, yeah.
Yeah, he won that round because School landed 1 punch on a terrible 20 throwing or something ridiculous. It was, again, like I joked about, we were getting kind of a Willie Pep type territory, but I imagine Pep's defense was entertaining in his fight when he went around without throwing a punch, supposedly. I don't think it's true, but that Canelo can win a round without landing a punch and throwing like 4. It just, God, that was such an awful weekend, except for the Inoue card. That was just the worst boxing I've seen. And and this again, I use literally correctly here. I literally cannot think of a worse series of fights over a weekend than we had last week.
Agreed.
I mean, you have to go to, I guess maybe if you went to a club show, but that doesn't count. Those guys are entertaining because they're out of control.
All right, so let's talk Ryzen for a minute, because they are expecting some pretty big pay-per-view numbers. And there's a rumor floating around that they're going to be meeting with PFL. What do you make of that? To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!